Our first story comes from a man named Eric. I've been camping most of my life. My father introduced me to it when I was a kid, and by the time I reached my 20s, I had spent hundreds of nights sleeping in tents all over the country. Because of that, I never considered myself someone who got scared easily outdoors. Animals didn't bother me. Strange noises didn't bother me. Being alone in the woods didn't bother me. At least, that was true until one weekend in the fall of 2021. I had decided to take a solo camping trip to a remote forest about 3 hours from my home. The place wasn't very popular. There were a few hiking trails and several primitive campsites spread throughout the area, but most people preferred larger parks with better facilities. That was exactly why I liked it. I arrived around noon. The weather was perfect. The sky was clear, and the air had that cool autumn feeling that makes camping enjoyable. I hiked for nearly 2 hours before reaching a small clearing where I planned to stay. There was no one else around, at least nobody that I could see. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and spent the afternoon exploring nearby trails. Everything felt normal. As evening approached, I built a campfire and cooked dinner. By 9 o'clock, darkness had completely swallowed the forest. The only light came from the flames in front of me. That's when I heard the first whistle. It was faint, a single note, short and sharp. I immediately looked into the darkness. Nothing. The forest was still. I listened carefully. A few seconds later, I heard it again. The exact same whistle. At first, I assumed it was another camper. Maybe somebody hiking nearby. Maybe someone trying to call a friend. I shrugged it off. About 10 minutes passed. Then I heard it again. This time it sounded closer. Much closer. I remember feeling slightly uneasy. Not terrified. Just uncomfortable. The whistle sounded strange. Almost too perfect. It didn't sound casual. It sounded deliberate. Like somebody standing still and making the exact same sound over and over. I stood up and shined my flashlight toward the trees. Nothing. The beam illuminated trunks and branches, but no people. No movement. No animals. Just darkness. I eventually convinced myself I was overthinking it. I sat back down. A few minutes later, the whistle came again. This time from behind me. I nearly jumped. The sound had somehow moved. Not only moved, but moved far enough that it should have taken somebody several minutes to reach that position. Yet only seconds had passed. I turned around quickly. Nothing. The darkness behind me seemed endless. I couldn't see more than 20 feet beyond the edge of the campsite. I decided to call out, "Hello?" No response. "Anybody out there?" Silence. For several minutes everything remained quiet. Then came another whistle. Closer than ever. I could have sworn it came from just beyond the tree line. At that point, I stopped enjoying my evening. I threw more wood onto the fire and stayed alert. For the next hour, the whistles continued. Always the same note. Always from a different direction. Never close enough to identify. Never far enough to ignore. Around midnight, I finally climbed into my tent. I zipped it shut and tried to sleep. The whistling continued. Every few minutes. One note, then silence. One note, then silence. I checked my phone. No signal. The forest felt much different from inside the tent. Every sound seemed amplified. Every crack of a branch made my heart race. Eventually, I drifted off. I don't know how long I slept. Maybe an hour. Maybe 2. What woke me was the sound of footsteps. Slow footsteps. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They circled my tent. At first I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard them again. Slow, deliberate, walking around me. I froze. The footsteps completed one circle. Then another. Then another. I reached for my flashlight. The beam illuminated the thin fabric walls. Nothing visible. Only shadows. The footsteps suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I held my breath. That's when the whistle came again. Right outside my tent. No more than a few feet away. I nearly screamed. The sound was so close that it felt impossible. Then came another whistle. From farther away. Then another. Even farther. As if whatever made the first whistle had instantly moved through the forest. I sat there for hours. Unable to sleep. Listening. Waiting. The footsteps never returned. Eventually morning arrived. Sunlight poured through the tent. Everything looked normal again. I packed my gear quickly. Before leaving, I decided to check around my campsite. That's when I noticed something strange. There were footprints. Human footprints. Lots of them. Circling my tent. The ground was soft enough to clearly show impressions. I followed the tracks. They led into the forest, then abruptly stopped. Not faded away. Stopped, as if whoever made them had vanished. I stood there staring for nearly a minute. Nothing made sense. I eventually convinced myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the tracks became harder to see. Maybe I simply lost them. I returned to my campsite. As I loaded my backpack, something caught my attention. Carved into a tree near the edge of the clearing were several words. The carving looked old, very old, but still readable. It said, "Don't whistle back." I felt a chill run through me. I hadn't whistled once during the entire trip, yet the message felt directed at me. I left immediately. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for information about the area. I found an old discussion forum where hikers shared strange experiences. Several people mentioned hearing whistles at night. Some claimed they heard them for hours. Others reported footsteps around their camps. One post stood out. The writer claimed that years earlier, a missing camper had been heard whistling near his campsite shortly before disappearing. His body was never found. Maybe all of it was just folklore. Maybe somebody had been messing with campers. But there's one thing I can never explain. The final whistle I heard that night, the one directly outside my tent, because when I reviewed the audio recording on my phone from that night, the whistle wasn't alone. Right after it, a quiet voice could be heard whispering 3 words. Words I never heard while I was there. Words that still bother me years later. "I found you." And then the recording ended. Our second story comes from a man named Kyle. This happened during the summer of 2022. I've always preferred camping alone. Most people think that's strange. They assume camping is supposed to be a social activity. For me, it was the opposite. I enjoyed getting away from people. No traffic, no phones, no noise, just the woods. That summer, I planned a 4-day camping trip in a remote section of a national forest. The trail I chose wasn't very popular. According to the ranger station, most hikers stayed on the easier routes closer to the main campground. The trail I picked stretched deep into the forest and eventually reached a small lake. That lake was where I intended to camp. The hike took most of the afternoon. By the time I arrived, I was exhausted. The lake was beautiful. The water was completely still. The surrounding trees reflected perfectly on the surface. Best of all, I was alone. At least, that's what I thought. I set up my tent near the shoreline and spent the evening fishing. As darkness fell, everything seemed normal. I ate dinner, watched the sunset, and eventually climbed into my sleeping bag. The first night passed without incident. The second day was just as peaceful. I explored the area, took photos, and relaxed. Around late afternoon, I decided to follow a narrow game trail that branched off from the main path. I wasn't expecting to find anything. I just wanted to explore. After about 20 minutes of walking, I noticed something unusual. The ground ahead looked disturbed. Branches had been broken. Leaves had been pushed aside. It looked as if someone had recently walked through the area. That wasn't impossible. Other hikers occasionally visited remote locations. Still, it surprised me. I continued forward. A few minutes later, I froze. There was a tent. A small green tent hidden among the trees. It was positioned far from any established campsite, far from the lake, far from the trail. It looked intentionally concealed. At first, I assumed another camper had simply wanted privacy, but something felt wrong. The tent looked old, not damaged, just old, as if it had been sitting there for a very long time. There was no campfire, no gear outside, no signs of activity. I called out, "Hello." Nothing. I waited. Still nothing. The forest remained silent. I didn't feel comfortable approaching any closer. The entire scene felt strange. So I turned around and headed back toward the lake. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about the tent. Why would someone camp there? Why hide so far from the trail? Eventually, I convinced myself it wasn't important. I went to sleep. Sometime during the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Everything was quiet. Then I heard it, a soft crunch, like somebody stepping on leaves. I listened carefully. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound came from outside my tent. Slow footsteps, moving around my campsite. My heart immediately started racing. I grabbed my flashlight. The footsteps stopped. Complete silence followed. I waited for several minutes. Nothing. Finally, I unzipped the tent and looked outside. The campsite was empty. No people, no animals, no movement. I checked the area with my flashlight. Nothing. Eventually, I returned to bed. The next morning, I discovered footprints. Human footprints. Fresh ones. They surrounded my campsite. The tracks came from a forest, circled my tent, then disappeared back into the trees. I immediately felt uneasy. Somebody had been there. While I slept, watching, I considered packing up and leaving. Instead, I decided to stay one more day. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe another camper got lost. Maybe someone was curious about my campsite. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that afternoon, I returned to the hidden tent. This time, I wanted answers. The tent was still there, completely silent. I cautiously approached. No sounds came from inside. No movement. The zipper was partially open. I hesitated. Then I looked inside. The tent was empty. There was no sleeping bag, no backpack, no supplies, nothing. Just dirt. The entire interior was empty, almost like the tent wasn't being used for camping at all. As I backed away, I noticed something nearby. A tree, at eye level. Several marks had been carved into the bark. At first they looked random. Then I realized they were dates. Dozens of dates. Some recent, some years old. Underneath them were short descriptions. Blue tent. Family of 3. Couple with dog. Solo camper. I stared at the words. My stomach dropped. They weren't random notes. They were descriptions of campers. Many campers. Then I saw the most recent entry. The date matched the day before. Underneath it were 2 words. Gray tent. That was my tent. For several seconds, I couldn't move. Somebody had recorded my campsite. Recently, very recently, I suddenly felt exposed, like eyes were watching me from somewhere in the trees. I left immediately. I practically jogged back to the lake. The moment I arrived, I began packing. I didn't care that I was cutting the trip short. I wanted out. Fast. The sun was beginning to set as I packed the last of my gear. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My tent had changed position. Only slightly, maybe 2 feet, but enough that I immediately noticed. At first I questioned myself. Maybe I remembered incorrectly. Maybe I was imagining things. Then I looked closer. The ground beneath the tent revealed its original position. Someone had physically moved it. While I was away, I grabbed my backpack and started hiking. I didn't even wait for full daylight. The forest became darker with every passing minute. The entire hike back felt wrong. Every sound made me turn around. Every shadow seemed suspicious. About an hour into the hike, I heard movement behind me. Footsteps, matching my pace. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I walked again. The footsteps returned. My heart pounded. I turned around. Nothing. Just trees. The sound continued several times over the next hour. Always behind me. Always staying out of sight. Eventually, darkness fell completely. I finally reached the parking area. Only one vehicle remained. Mine. I threw my gear into the back and got inside. As I started the engine, something caught my eye. A folded piece of paper was tucked beneath my windshield wiper. I froze. My car had been untouched when I arrived. Slowly, I unfolded the paper. Written in messy handwriting were 5 words. I like the gray tent. No name. No explanation. Nothing else. I immediately drove away. I reported everything to park authorities the following day. Several weeks later, a ranger contacted me. He wanted additional information about the hidden tent. Apparently, When officials searched the area, they found nothing. No tent, no carvings, no campsite, nothing at all. The entire location appeared abandoned. To this day, I still have a note. And sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. Because whoever left that message clearly knew exactly where I was. And for some reason, they seemed disappointed that I left. Our final story comes from a man named Daniel. Out of all the strange things I've experienced while camping, this is the one memory I can never fully explain. It's also the reason I haven't spent a single night in a tent since. This happened in October of 2020. At the time, I was going through a difficult period in my life. I had recently ended a long relationship and needed time alone. Camping had always been my way of clearing my head. So I took a few days off work and reserved a campsite in a remote state forest. The campground itself wasn't completely isolated. There were about 20 campsites spread around a large wooded area. Most were empty. By the time I arrived, only 3 sites appeared occupied. Mine was Site 17. It sat near the edge of the forest, farther away from the others. At first, I considered requesting a different location. Something about the area felt strange. The trees seemed unusually dense. The silence felt heavier, but I ignored the feeling. After all, that was exactly why I came. I wanted solitude. The first evening was uneventful. I built a fire, cooked dinner, read a book. By around 11 o'clock, I climbed into my tent and went to sleep. Sometime during the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had burned out. The forest was completely dark. Then I heard it. A voice. Soft. Calm. Almost a whisper. Hello. I sat upright. For a moment, I wondered if I had dreamed it. Then the voice came again. Hello. This time I was sure. Someone was outside. I checked my phone. 2:14 a.m. My heart immediately started racing. Who would be wandering around a campground at 2 in the morning? I remained silent. The voice spoke again. Can you help me? The words sounded closer, just beyond the tent. The voice belonged to a woman. She sounded frightened. Lost. My first instinct was to unzip the tent and see what was wrong. But something stopped me. I couldn't explain it. The situation felt wrong. Very wrong. Instead, I called out, Are you okay? There was a brief pause. Then the woman replied, I think I'm lost. I frowned. Lost? Inside a campground? That made no sense. The roads were clearly marked. The campsites were numbered. Even in darkness, it would be difficult to become completely lost. Still, I felt guilty ignoring someone who might genuinely need help. I reached for my flashlight. Before I could unzip the tent, the woman spoke again. This time her tone sounded different, almost impatient. Please come outside. A chill ran through me. Something about the way she said it felt unnatural. I hesitated. Then I remembered advice I'd heard years earlier. If someone needs help, they usually explain the problem. They don't repeatedly ask you to come outside. I decided to stay where I was. I'm calling the campground office. I shouted. The response came immediately. No, not please, not thank you, just no. The words sounded cold, almost angry. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I heard footsteps moving around my campsite, slowly circling the tent. Crunch, crunch, crunch. My breathing became shallow. The footstep continued. One complete circle, then another, then another. I gripped the flashlight tightly. The voice spoke again. Only now it sounded different. Much different. Deeper. Not female. Not male. Just wrong. Like someone attempting to imitate a human voice. Come outside. Every hair on my body stood up. I didn't respond. The footsteps stopped. Silence filled the forest. Then something struck the side of my tent. A loud impact. I nearly screamed. The tent wall shook violently. A second impact followed. Then a third. Whatever was outside had begun hitting the tent. I grabbed my keys and prepared to run. But then everything stopped. No footsteps. No voice. Nothing. The silence lasted almost 20 minutes. I never moved. I sat completely still, listening, waiting. Finally, exhaustion caught up with me. At some point I must have fallen asleep. When morning arrived, sunlight illuminated the tent. Everything seemed normal again. For a few moments, I convinced myself I had exaggerated the entire experience. Then I stepped outside. The first thing I noticed was a lack of footprints. There had been heavy dew overnight. The ground should have shown tracks. Yet there were none. Not one. No footprints near the tent. No signs anyone had walked through the campsite. Nothing. Then I saw something else. 3 deep dents in the side of my tent, exactly where the impact had occurred. Something had struck it. Hard. I packed my belongings and headed toward the campground office. The ranger on duty listened carefully as I described what happened. When I finished, he became unusually quiet. Finally, he asked a question. What campsite were you in? Site 17. His expression changed immediately, almost like he had expected that answer. After a long pause, he sighed. Then he told me something I wish I'd never heard. Years earlier, a woman had vanished near Site 17. She had left her campsite during the night and never returned. Large search teams spent weeks looking for her. No body was ever found. No suspects were identified. Nothing. The case remained unsolved. Naturally, I assumed the story was unrelated, just a coincidence, until the ranger mentioned one final detail. According to witnesses camping nearby that night, the woman had been heard calling for help before she disappeared. Several campers reported hearing her voice moving between campsites, as if she were walking through the campground, calling out to people. Nobody helped because they assumed someone else would. The ranger shrugged. People still report strange things around that site. I laughed nervously. What kind of things? He looked directly at me. Voices. I left shortly afterward. For months, I tried not to think about the experience. Then one evening, nearly a year later, I received an email. It came from an unknown address. There was no message, only an attachment, a photograph. The image showed my campsite, Site 17. The picture had clearly been taken at night. The quality was poor, but there was enough moonlight to see the tent. My tent, the same tent from that trip. I stared at the image for several seconds, confused. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The photograph had been taken from only a few feet away. Someone had been standing directly beside my tent. At 2:14 a.m., the exact time I heard the voice. My hands were shaking as I zoomed in, and that's when I saw the figure, standing between 2 trees behind the campsite, watching. Its face was impossible to make out. Its body appeared unnaturally tall, almost stretched. The figure wasn't standing near my tent. It was standing nearly 50 feet away, which meant whoever took the photograph wasn't the figure. Someone else had been there too. The metadata attached to the image was even worse. The photo hadn't been taken in 2020. It had been taken 2 days before the email was sent. Nearly a year later, somebody had returned to Site 17. Somebody had stood beside my old campsite in the middle of the night, and somehow they knew exactly where my tent had been. The sender was never identified. The email account no longer exists, and to this day, I still have that photograph saved on an external drive. I've only looked at it twice, because every time I do, I notice something new, something I somehow missed before. The last time I opened it, I realized the figure wasn't looking at the camera. It wasn't looking at the tent either. It was looking directly at the person taking the picture, as if it had just noticed them, a fraction of a second before the photo was taken. And whatever happened after that moment was never captured.